Hello, everyone. Welcome to our next session in our Literary Terms and Devices series. As I'm sure you already know, we have been talking about poetry for a few sessions now. And in our previous session last week, we started talking about poetic forms. Now, obviously, if you have already seen that video, you know that we talked about some of the most popular poetic forms in the English language. And today we continue doing so by talking about other poetic forms which are utilized by different poets for different purposes. So if you haven't seen the previous video, please pause this one and go back and watch that video first, and then come back and continue watching this video. So once again, we are concerned with some poetic forms which are quite commonly utilized by a lot of poets. But today we talk about some special ones, and I call them special because when it comes to rhyming, they are a little bit different from the established forms of English poetry when we had rhymes at the end of our lines. And so today we talk about some specific poetic forms in which the end rhymes are non existent. So, first, let's begin by talking about blank verse. So, blank verse is a literary term that refers to a special kind of poetry which is unrhymed at the end, but it is still metered. And the meter which is commonly used in blank verse is iambic pentameter. So, just to quickly recap, uh, blank verse is a poetic form in which the lines are not rhymed at the end. There is no rhyme scheme at the end of the line. Like the first and the third lines do not rhyme. The second and the fourth lines do not rhyme. There is no rhyme scheme. However, there is still meter. And that is a very important point to keep in mind because we have another kind of poetry, which we will talk about today later on, which has neither rhyme nor meter. Okay, so just keep that in mind. That even though blank verse does not have end rhymes, the lines are still metered, and the most common meter which is used in blank verse is iambic pentameter. Just to refresh your memory, because I talked about iambic pentameter in one of the videos probably 2 or 3 weeks ago. And I really hope that you still remember that, but if you don't worry. I'm going to talk about it very quickly here. We said that iambic pentameter is the most common meter in English because it resembles, English language itself. It is a line of poetry written in a way in which iambs, or groups of two syllables, when one of them is unstressed and the other one is stressed, are juxtaposed. They are written next to one another. Okay, so we have talked about it. The first syllable is usually unstressed, and the second one is stressed, like a heartbeat, ba-dum, ba-dum, ba-dum. And the second one is always stressed, and the first one unstressed. Now, traditionally speaking, these lines of iambic pentameter were used in rhymed poetic forms, like the sonnet. So sonnets usually used iambic pentameters, but they also had rhyme schemes at the end. Okay, let's take a look at the Shakespeare's Sonnet 18, which we have discussed for a few weeks, which we have been discussing for a few weeks now. Again, let's take a look at this, the first 4 lines of this sonnet. Shall I compare thee to a summer's day, thou art more lovely and more temperate. Okay, so the meter should be obvious when you read it. Ba-dum, 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 something like that. So shall I compare thee to a summer's day? Thou art more lovely and more temperate. Rough winds do shake the darling buds of May, and summer's lease hath all too short a date. As you can see here, the first and the third line, as well as the second and the fourth lines, rhyme. So traditionally, iambic pentameter was used in some poetic forms which also had end rhymes. In blank verse, however, there are no end rhymes. And so, lines of metered verse, iambic pentameter, usually follow each other without being connected by rhyming words. Okay, so there are no rhymes at the end. And just keep in mind that blank verse is not really a recent invention, no. Shakespeare himself, or even Christopher Marlowe, his contemporary, popularized the use of blank verse for plays, for drama. However, if we still want to talk about poetry, so keep in mind that blank verse was also used in drama. However, the most famous early example of a poem which was composed in blank verse is, of course, without a doubt, John Milton's masterpiece, Paradise Lost, which I talked about in the previous video. Okay, and I hope you have watched the video and you remember that section. It first appeared in 1674 in a 12-book format. Now, before talking about the poem itself, which of course I did last week, or before reading the first 10 lines of the poem written in blank verse, I would like to talk about the preface that John Milton wrote for Paradise Lost, because the preface includes John Milton's arguments about why he has chosen blank verse for this epic. Okay, so in the prefatory note to the poem, Milton argues that, he has written Paradise Lost in English heroic verse without rhyme. And so the heroic verse that he is talking about is an unrhymed iambic pentameter without the, of course, rhyme, as we said. And then Milton argues that he has done so because he wants to follow the classical writers like Homer and Virgil, who wrote their epics in Greek and Latin, respectively, and both of them used this kind of unrhymed lines. Okay, so, and because he wants to set himself up as the successor to these great epic writers, he has decided to adapt this kind of unrhymed metered line in the English language. Milton doesn't stop there. He goes on and he justifies his use of blank verse. And he says, rhyme was the invention of a barbarous age to set up wretched matter and lay meter. Now, he confesses that some of his contemporaries are actually using rhyme pretty well, but he also says that they are carried away by this rule, and this rule is quite restrictive. This tradition is quite restrictive and curbs their creativity, okay? And so that's why he says that I don't want to be restricted by this ludicrous rule of poetry which forces me to find words which sound like each other. So this is meaningless for Milton. So he says that there will be no childish or vulgar rhymes in my poetry, in Paradise Lost, because I have some epic ambitions. I want to tell you a story of epic proportions, and I don't want to be restricted by my poetry, by my lines. And so, and the reason why, if we think about it, the reason why Milton felt the need to justify his decision to use blank verse tells you that the readers of his day actually expected to read rhymed verse. However, Milton tells them, hey, don't be, too judgmental. I have actually recovered the ancient liberty and freedom which Homer and Virgil had. They had the freedom to talk about whatever topic they wanted without the troublesome and modern bondage of rhyming. So for him, rhyming is bondage. Okay, so we talked about this preface that Milton himself has written. So what does blank verse allow John Milton to do in Paradise Lost? Now, let's not forget that the most common form of poetry in John Milton's time was the couplet, the two-line rhymed, form of poetry. But couplets, yes, they are very easy to remember and easy to memorize. However, the philosophy behind the couplet is that the author, the poet, should try to finish his thought in just two lines. So the poet is actually expected to finish his argument, to finish his thought in just two lines, which is, of course, meaningless when you come to an epic topic like the fall of human beings from heaven onto the earth and the way they interact with Satan. And so that was one of the reasons why he tried to, move away from these rhymed couplets. Now, before we move on and read the first 10 lines of Paradise Lost, I want to bring an example of the kind of poetry which was popular in Milton's period, the one that he talks about, these couplets. And for this, I want to talk about a poem by Marvell called To His Coy Mistress, published, in 1681, which uses the couplet which I have talked about before. So let's take a look at this. Just two lines, couplets. Had we but world enough and time, this coyness lady were no crime. So here, because it is love poetry, a person here, a lover, is complaining to his lady that, why are you so coy? Why don't you, accept my offer and my proposal? Why are you being coy? We don't have all the time in the world. Our life is ephemeral. Our time is gonna end. Our time is gonna end soon on this earth. So why are you being so coy? Why don't you accept my proposal? Why don't you let me be your partner? Now, obviously, these two lines have a complete thought. I'm not saying that this is the poem. No, the poem has other lines too. But each two lines, each group of two lines has a complete thought. That is the couplet. However, let's take a look at the first 10 lines of, John Milton's Paradise Lost to see if we can see a finished thought after two lines. Of man's first disobedience. Oh, and by the way, do you remember I gave you a quiz and I told you that this is an example of iambic pentameter in which the writer has broken the rule? The rule is broken here in the word disobedience because there are two stressed syllables written after each other in this word. Okay, so and it is significant for us because Milton wants to say that just because I am talking about disobedience, I am going to disobey the rules of iambic pentameter, and I'm going to write two stressed syllables one after the other. Let's continue reading. Of man's first disobedience, and the fruit of that forbidden tree whose mortal taste brought death into the world, and all our woe, with loss of Eden, till one greater man restore us and regain the blissful seat, sing, heavenly muse. Now, up to here, up to this part, we don't know who he's talking to, what this is all about. So he's all saying that, okay, something terrible happened to all of us. We came down from heaven, we were punished. And then suddenly he says, sing, heavenly muse. So we know who the interlocutor is, who Milton is addressing, who the persona of the poem is addressing. That on the sacred top of the Orib of Sinai didst inspire the shepherd who first taught the chosen seed in the beginning, how the heavens and earth rose out of chaos. So, the first four lines, we are really not sure what he's talking about until we get to sing heavenly muse. Then we know who he's addressing and what the poem is going to be about. And so these 10 lines or 9.5 lines, if you just, you can write them as a long sentence if you want to write the prose form of it. And that's why Milton decided not to write couplets, because they would be quite restrictive for him. And so this blank verse actually allows Milton to create or form long, complex, and periodic sentences. What is a periodic sentence? A periodic sentence is a sentence in which the main argument, the main part of the sentence comes not at the beginning, but at the end. And so the reader, and so a lot of writers use it to create suspense so that the listener or the reader doesn't know what the sentence is about until they get to the final part of the sentence. That's the definition of a periodic sentence. So blank verse allows Milton to create periodic sentences, which are, of course, usually, not usually, almost always used in prose. This kind of blank verse allows Milton to create periodic sentences in poetry. And that's why he has chosen blank verse. And so, as we said, Milton is free to ignore all of those, end lines and rhymes, etc., and uses a lot of enjambment. Now, we will talk about this next week. Oh, and by the way, I forgot, our poetry sessions are not going to be over this week, so, as we were supposed to, because there is just too much information, and I think that it would be boring to talk about all of the remaining words and devices and terms in this session. So next week, we are going to continue talking about poetry. And once we finish it, we will be ready to talk about those terms and devices listed under the category of general. Okay. So next week, which will be online, by the way, will be dedicated to the rest of the words and terms and devices used in poetry. Okay, so Milton is also free when he uses blank verse to create lines. Now, we will talk about this next week, but enjambment occurs when there is no punctuation at the end of a poetic line, which means that you shouldn't pause, you shouldn't stop, and you should continue reading to the next. You should continue, to the next line and continue reading the line. And so this allows Milton to kind of shatter your presuppositions, because when you are reading a couplet, you know that the thought is going to be complete in the second line, so you have some understanding of when the thought is going to be complete. However, when there is blank verse involved, you have no idea when the thought is going to be complete, and so that's why it is more demanding on the part of the reader as well. You have to be extra careful. Okay, so because of the success of Paradise Lost, there's another term to describe blank verse, and it is called Miltonic verse. So blank verse is also called Miltonic verse because this book was extremely successful. And because Milton used it so ambitiously and for such a great topic, it is now primarily deployed, blank verse is now primarily deployed for serious and elevated topics. So you shouldn't use blank verse for something trivial. Now, this was the feeling this was the feeling in English literature after John Milton published his Paradise Lost, that if you are a poet and you want to be taken seriously by the society, you have to at least write one poem in blank verse. And that is exactly what William Wordsworth did in the 19th century in the Romantic period, when he wanted to establish himself as one of the founding fathers of Romanticism, with, of course, Samuel Taylor Coleridge. And so in one of his most important poems, Tintern Abbey, which of course has a very long title, this is the original title, which is quite long. Lines written a few miles above Tintern Abbey on revisiting the banks of the Wey during a tour July 3rd, 1989, which of course is commonly known as Tintern Abbey. So Wordsworth uses this blank verse format to talk about his memories of this part. I think it's a river. And so, he tries to, reminisce about his past. And so the topic is quite serious. And the issues discussed in the poem, the fact that this part of England has had such a great influence on of course, Wordsworth. These are all great topics for blank verse. And that poem actually establishes Wordsworth as one of the greatest poets in English language. Let's read a few lines, blank verse here. And once again, just look at how, without the constraints of the end rhyme, so there is no end rhyme here, so the limit or the constraint has been removed. So Wordsworth is able to create some poetic lines that run into each other just like sentences. And so they compel the reader, they force the reader to continue with the flow of the poet's thoughts. When, of course, he's talking about the Wye River and how influential this part was for him. 5 years have passed, 5 summers with the length of 5 long winters. And again, I hear these waters rolling from their mountain springs with a sweet inland murmur. Once again do I behold these steep and lofty cliffs, which on a wild, secluded scene impress thoughts of more deep seclusion, and connect the landscape with the quiet sky, the quiet of the sky. So this is blank verse. There are some modern poets as well, especially in American literature. We have Hart Crane and Wallace Stevens who use blank verse a lot. However, when we go to the 20th century, most of the poets prefer to use another form of poetry which has even fewer rules, and that is light verse, which of course, free verse, which we are going to talk about in the next section. And because free verse doesn't even need to be needn't to be written in a metered line, a lot of poets said that, okay, I don't want any rules in my poetry. I don't want rhymes, I don't want meter, I don't want anything, any rules, any formal rules. And that's why they try to write in free verse. Okay, now let's talk about free verse and see what free verse is. Free verse is also known as open form, or the French word vers libre. So it has some irregular lines, so it has irregular line lengths, and there is no regular metrical form. So we cannot say it is iambic pentameter or anapestic something. No, we don't have a regular metrical form. And also when it comes to rhyming, either it lacks rhyming altogether or uses rhyming only sporadically. So you cannot really find a rhyme scheme here, because 2 lines may rhyme, but then the rest of the poem may not rhyme at all. And so that's why we say that when it comes to rhyming, there is no regular or rhyme scheme to be found in free verse. It was practiced mostly in the 19th century in the poetry of William Blake, one of the dark romantics, in the poetry of Matthew Arnold. But of course, the most important poet who kind of, shattered and, astonished all of the world with his book was, of course, Walt Whitman, when he published Leaves of Grass, written in free verse. This kind of became the book, the reference book for so many other poets to look at and to model their poetry on Whitman's verses. It also became quite popular in the 20th century, and it influenced the poetry of T.S. Eliot, Ezra Pound, William Carlos Williams, and all of them have some poems written in free verse. Now, it is important to know that free verse has 2 very different traditions and variations. On the one hand, we have some poets like Whitman himself, like Allen Ginsberg, who was the leader of a group of poets called the Beat generation of poets who lived in California. Specifically, they lived in San Francisco, and they were against the establishment. They were against they are quite postmodern. They actually hated the Vietnam War, and they were like hippies. They wanted to live happily and freely without the constraints of a central government. And so they despised the central government of the United States. And so they were against, any kind of federal government being in place. They wanted just to be freely because they thought that all of those rules actually constrained human freedom. one of the most important poems that Allen Ginsberg has written is Howl, which became the manifesto of um, the Beat Generation. I actually have an original copy of the book. You know, the book was published in a bookstore called City Lights Bookstore, which is in San Francisco. I actually went to that bookstore, City Lights Bookstore, and I bought an original version of the Howl. And one day when we go back to in-person classes, I will bring my copy and I will show you. And it is fascinating that right across from the City Lights bookstore on the other side of the street in downtown San Francisco, there is a Beat Museum, which is a museum dedicated entirely to all of the poets and writers associated with the Beat generation, with the Beat movement, including Allen Ginsberg and Jack Kerouac, who actually wrote a very famous book called On the Road. Anyway, one day we might be able to look at all the pictures I took of, the bookstore as well as the museum. Anyway, so Whitman and Ginsberg actually follow the first tradition of free verse, which uses long-lined orotund verse based on the translation of the Hebrew Bible. And so their inspiration was the translation of the Hebrew Bible, in which the lines are quite long and the lines are actually quite heavy and very difficult to understand. That is one tradition and one variation of free verse. The second variation is easier to follow. It has short lines, it is very conversational, and sometimes it is ironic. And in this shorter form, sometimes meter is noticeable, but not always, because free verse doesn't really need any kind of meter. Now, this became actually quite popular in the 20th and even, in late 20th century. However, there were some poets and critics who hated free verse, and they said that, well, this is meaningless. Poetry should have some rules, and when you write something that is like prose and just the line lengths are different, you cannot really call it poetry. This was the argument. This was the problem that a lot of critics raised with free verse. They were saying that free verse actually is just like prose, and the writer has only, hit enter, enter, enter after a few words so that they look like poetry. And so they, there was a movement called New Formalism in poetry, which advocated for a return to traditional meters, rhyme, and stanza forms. And so the followers of New Formalism actually hated free verse and wanted poets to go back to those traditional forms, like, for example, sonnets and odes, etc., in which we have a specific meter and a specific rhyme scheme and stanzaic structure. So that is also something to keep in mind. Let's read an example by Walt Whitman, right? Okay, so we said that Walt Whitman is like the godfather, like the poet when it comes to free verse. And I'm going to read, I've actually chosen a very interesting poem here for you, when kind of there is a comparison between a spider on the wall who's just, wandering aimlessly, and then the soul of the persona who's just as clueless as the spider. And the name of the poem is Noiseless Patient Spider by Walt Whitman. A noiseless patient spider I marked where on a little promontory it stood isolated, marked how to explore the vacant, vast surrounding. It launched forth filament, filament, filament out of itself, ever unreeling them, ever tirelessly speeding them. And you, O my soul, where you stand, surrounded, detached in measureless oceans of space, till the bridge you will need be formed, till the ductile anchor hold, till the gossamer thread you fling catch somewhere, O my soul. So just as the spider who doesn't know where to go unless he has, launched some filament and there's a web so that he knows where to go next, the soul of the persona is just wandering aimlessly until the soul can find its way. And so there's this comparison by Walt Whitman in this kind of free verse. There is no meter, there is no rhyme, and it's just like prose. Okay, so next we are going to talk about free verse. Sorry, my bad. Next we're going to talk about light verse because we finished talking about free verse. So light verse, where does the word light come from here? What does it mean? Well, light here refers to the tone of the poem, and it means, light-hearted, jokingly and, happily, even sometimes satirically, talking about a serious subject matter, okay? So that's why we call it light verse. So light has something to do with the tone of the poem as well as the attitude of the speaker towards the subject matter that he's discussing. So it is a variety of poetry in which, an ordinary speaking voice, just a regular person, uses a relaxed manner to treat the subject matter gaily, playfully, wittily, or even with good-natured satire. So even if it is satire, it's not dark satire. It's just good-natured, funny satire. The subject matter, however, doesn't necessarily have to be something petty, trivial, or worthless. No, the subject matter can be something as serious as the death of a person. It could be something tragic. In fact, the example which we are going to read and talk about is talking about the death of a person. It's about the death of a king. It's a tragic topic. However, the tone of voice used in the poem and the attitude of the speaker, those are the qualities which make the poem light verse, because the tone of voice is just, just very witty and playful, and the attitude is just, dispassionate. And so the end product is a poem in which the topic might be, something important or even something tragic. However, the treatment of that subject is quite playful and light-hearted. Now, the best example here we have is Tomislav Peacock's The War Song of Dinas Var, in which the topic is quite tragic. However, the tone and the attitude, the tone is quite dispassionate, and the attitude is colloquial. Now, I'm going to read it for you. It's on page 193 of our book, A Glossary of Literary Terms. However, I'm not going to read all of it, just the beginning and the end of the poem. So this is the beginning. The mountain sheep are sweeter, but the valley sheep are fatter. We therefore deemed it meter to carry off the latter. And so, these kind of soldiers, they want fat sheep. And then it ends like this. We brought away from battle. So a group of soldiers go to war, kill a king, bring back the head of the king. The topic is quite tragic. But just look how the persona, how the speaker is talking about it. We brought away from battle and much their land bemoaned them, 2,000 head of cattle, and the head of him who owned them. Ednifed, king of Dyfed, his head was born before us, his wine and beasts supplied our feasts, and his overthrow our chorus. And so he says that, it was fun because we stole the sheep, we brought back the head, his beasts supplied our feasts, and then his overthrow, the story of us killing him and overthrowing him, actually became our chorus and became a topic for our song. And as you can see, there is no emotions, no, feeling sorry for, for that opponent, nothing here. And that's why we call it light verse. There are so many subcategories of light verse which you have to know about. The first one is, it's again a French word, vers de société, which is a society verse, which of course deals with the relationships, the concerns, the deeds, and the life of the polite upper classes. However, this kind of poem deals with those upper class people in a very, satirical or light-hearted manner. There are also other subcategories of light verse like nursery rhymes, which we talked about, one of our previous videos, and of course children's verses, and of course limerick. Limerick is a kind of humorous, rude, sometimes rude. The topic can be quite rude. 5-line poem, which of course rhymes A-A-B-B-A. If you just, search for it, most of them are quite rude. So if you search for them on the internet, you can find some examples. So limerick, nursery rhymes, children's verses, and society verse are all subcategories of light verse. Okay, let's move on to the next poetic form for today's session, which is of course a hymn. What is a hymn? A hymn is a song that celebrates God or expresses some form of religious feeling. Hymns were usually intended to be sung in religious ceremonies and in religious services in the church. And the origin of the word, the etymology of the word, is that it comes from Greek, from a word called hymnos, which of course means the song of praise, which was originally reserved for the pagan gods of Greek mythology, as well as the heroes of Greek mythology. The lines in hymns are either taken from the Old Testament lines, so they are either taken from the Psalms of the Old Testament to praise the Christian God. So either they are copies from the Old Testament or they are written by church authors. So either they are like copies modeled on the Old Testament or they are original written by church authors. Now, as you can guess from what I have just told you about hymns, some of them are quite religious and they were actually sung in churches to praise the Christian God. However, some of them are called literary hymns, and which of course came into existence, after the Renaissance period. After the Renaissance period, a lot of people followed the rules of traditional hymns and started writing literary ones. And these literary ones are no longer about the Christian God because they were not written to be sung in churches. They were written to be read by ordinary readers like you and me. And that's why the topics are usually either pagan gods, the gods of the the Greek world and Greek and Roman mythology, or they are about secular subject matters. There are so many different examples. One example is Edmund Spenser's Four Hymns, which of course celebrates not only heavenly love and beauty, but also earthly love and, of course, beauty. There are, as I said, other samples which are addressed to pagan gods, like two very important poems by two famous romantic poets, John Keats and Shelley. Both of them have written hymns to Apollo. And, of course, one of the gods of Greek mythology, Apollo, the son of Zeus and Leto, who was the god of hunt, just like his sister Artemis, or Diana in the Roman version. So secular hymns usually resemble odes. You have to keep that in mind. There's also one form written by African American people. Of course, most of them are anonymous. We don't really know who the writer was. They were usually hymns, written for the slaves. They were singing all of these hymns in praise of God, and sometimes not in praise of God, sometimes just to read on the plantations where they worked, and so we call them spirituals. So if a hymn is written by one of these anonymous African American writers, we call them spirituals. Okay, let's read a sample from John Keats' Hymn to Apollo and just look at how he praises the god. And of course, the god is a pagan god. Pagan is the religion of the Greeks. All of the religions before Christianity are usually called pagan. God of the golden bow, God of the golden lyre, and of the golden hair, and of the golden fire, charioteer of the patient year, where were slipped thine ire, when like a blank idiot I put on thy wreath, thy laurel, thy glory, the light of thy story. Oh, or was I a worm too low crawling for death, O Delphic Apollo? So songs in written in praise of a god or a deity or even heroes or even secular topics are called hymns. Let's now talk about another poetic form, a haiku. What is a haiku? Well, haiku is a Japanese poetic form that is usually written to represent the poet's emotional or even spiritual response to a natural object, to a natural scene, or to the beauty of one of the seasons of the year. The one of the rules of writing haiku is that it should have only 17 syllables. And these 17 syllables should be written and should be arranged into 3 lines with this formula. The first line should only have 5 syllables. The second line should have 7 syllables. And of course, the final line should have 5 syllables. Now, just keep in mind that this was traditionally written in Japanese, and in Japanese, achieving this was actually quite easy. However, it is extremely hard to achieve in the English language, and that's why the English practitioners of the form usually, look at these rules quite loosely. They don't follow it strictly. And that's why haikus in English are not as strictly written as the Japanese ones. This form influenced Ezra Pound, one of the most influential poets of the 20th century, and other poets who followed Ezra Pound and established a school of poetry, which we will talk about next week, called Imagism. And so Ezra Pound and the other imagists who wanted to capture the essence of an image in a short poem were highly influenced by the Japanese poetic form called haiku. There were in Japan there were 4 masters of haiku, and so they were known as the Great Four. We have Basho, we have Issa, we have Shiki, and we have Busan. Their work, when it is translated into English, it loses some of the beauty of the language and the feelings as well. However, we can read some examples just to see how these lines are written. So the first one is by Basho, and the second one is by Issa. An old silent pond, a frog jumps into the pond. Splash! Silence again. Everything I touch with tenderness, alas, pricks like a bramble, which is a kind of tree. I think torange, if I'm not mistaken. So everything I touch with tenderness, I am being kind. I use a tender touch, but everything I touch turns against me and just, bites me like the pricks on a bramble tree or bush. Okay, and these are 2 examples of haiku. The next thing we are going to talk about is called dream vision or dream allegory. What is a dream vision? What is a dream allegory? Just keep in mind that dream allegories can also be written in prose. So we do have some prose dream visions, but it was first popular in poetry. Well, first of all, what is an allegory? An allegory is a story in which there is a moral, lesson beneath the surface events. Usually there are 2 meanings, a surface meaning and a deeper meaning. Of course, we will talk about allegory later on in one of our next sessions, but just keep in mind that that is what an allegory is about. In Farsi, in Persian, we call it tamthil royagune, dream allegory. It is a narrative form which was popular among medieval poets. In this kind of poetry, the narrator, the persona of the poem, usually falls asleep in a scenic location when he is in nature, and usually in the season of spring when the scenes are quite beautiful and eye-pleasing. And then he dreams, and the events of his dream are recounted for the readers. Now, the events which usually are recounted are allegorical in nature, which means that they have double meanings and there is usually a moral behind the surface of the events. There are so many different examples. Roman de la Rose is a medieval example, a French example. And then we have William Langland's Piers Plowman, which is, of course, another example of this kind of poem. And because they are usually very long, we cannot actually, read a sample today. And of course, probably the most famous one for you guys, Dante's Divine Comedy, in which the poet falls asleep and then goes on a journey, and then the journey that he embarks on actually constitutes the poem that we are reading. And finally, let's talk about a palinode. What is a palinode? A palinode is actually, again, a Greek word which means song again or sing again. What does it mean? It is a kind of poetry in which the poet renounces or retracts an earlier poem or subject matter. What do I mean by this? Usually poets write about so many different topics, but sometimes they feel regretful for having written about a particular subject matter or for having written a specific poem. Fortunately for them, there is a way to make up for your mistake. And the way to make up for your mistake is to write another poem called Palinode, in which you confess that you were mistaken in the previous poem and you want to retract whatever you have said. There are so many different examples in English. I'm going to talk about Geoffrey Chaucer here for you in greater detail, but just another example for you to know is Sir Philip Sidney's Leave Me a Love, which reaches but to dust, in which, Sidney says that I am no longer interested in, sexual attractions and earthly love. And from now on, I'm going to talk about heavenly love. So that is a palinode. Probably the most famous one in English, of course, in the medieval period is Geoffrey Chaucer's The Legend of Good Women. But what is this about? Geoffrey Chaucer is, as many critics have confessed and have argued, is the father of English poetry and the father of English language for some people, because it was Chaucer who decided to write in vernacular English. And he was one of the earliest English poets. He has written so many important works, including, for example, the Canterbury Tales, which is one of the fundamental works of English literature. Now, in one of his works called Troilus and Crusade, which of course was influenced by the Italian poet Boccaccio, he portrays women in a negative way. So in Troilus and Crusade, Geoffrey Chaucer presents women or describes women in a negative light. Let me tell you what this story is about. It was written in 1385, and it is the longest narrative poem written by Geoffrey Chaucer, and it is the only long poem of Chaucer's which has been completed. Because, for example, Canterbury Tales, not complete. We don't have the complete version. So, Troilus and Crusade is actually the longest, the only long poem of his which has been completed. He was influenced by Boccaccio, but in this poem, he was influenced by Il Filostrato, which was, of course, written by Boccaccio. But what does it mean, Il Filostrato? Which is, of course, a word chosen by Boccaccio, meaning a person who has lost a game of love and now has fallen to the ground like a fallen soldier. So what's the story about? The story of Troilus and Crusade happens during the Trojan War. We have a man called Troilus who has always, ridiculed love and lovers. He has never believed in love. And of course, one day he sees a widow called Crusade. Now, of course, Crusade is on the, on the forces of the enemy. And so, well, Troilus cannot really, find a way to get in touch with Crusade and to, uh, start a relationship with Cressida. However, Cressida has an uncle who helps these two meet and talk about their life together in the future. And the name of the uncle is of course Calchas. The father of Cressida, however, disagrees and does not allow the union to materialize. And so Troilus and Cressida are in a limbo. At the same time, Cressida is chosen as and of course, she's not unwilling, so she also wants it. She's chosen now that she knows that she cannot be with Troilus. She is chosen as the beloved of Diomede, another important figure in Greek, in the Greek story of Troy. And so Troilus and Cressida cannot, you know, find the union that they wanted at the beginning of the story. Now, later on, Troilus is killed and he enters heaven. And then when he enters heaven, he looks down on the earth and then realizes something, realizes that, earthly love is ludicrous, and the only love which is permanent, which is not going to betray you, is that God is the love of God. Now, in this poem, Troilus and Cressida, Cressida, the woman, is considered as a person who is nonchalant. She really doesn't care if she goes with Troilus or if she goes with Diomede. And so she's, considered as, this kind of heartless creature who doesn't really care about Troilus and only leads him on, gives him the feeling that, yeah, I'm in love with you. And then after a few days, she goes to another man called Diomede, even though the father also insists on her going to Diomede. The portrayal of women in this poem was somehow not favorable in Chaucer's time. And so Geoffrey Chaucer decides to write another poem called The Legend of Good Women, in which women are portrayed as lovers who are very loyal and they do everything for their lovers, and they become symbols of piety, of virtue, of loyalty to their lovers. Okay, so this one is also a Palinode by Geoffrey Chaucer, in which he says that I'm sorry, I was mistaken in Troilus and Cressida, and I want to renounce, I want to retract whatever was hurtful in this work by writing another poem called The Legend of Good Women. And so basically that wraps up our session today. As I told you, our sessions on poetry, terms, and devices related to poetry are not over yet. Next session, when we go back to online classes, we will continue talking about poetry and we will try to finish all of the remaining terms and devices. And once we do that, we are ready to talk about those general terms and devices. Anyway, thank you very much for watching the video. I hope this was useful. And once again, happy Persian New Year to all of you. And hopefully I'll see you next week. Thank you very much. Have a good day and bye-bye.